The phrase, as American as apple pie, is a classic one that harkens back to American culture in the days of homemade pies and gingham picnic blankets, and harkens back even further to an apple culture that's largely forgotten in America and folk heroes like Johnny Appleseed. But of course, apples are much older, and even the humble pie long predates our nation. Its invention is not only not American, but particularly British. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Pie can bring some happiness, but sometimes it takes more than that. So thank you, BetterHelp, for sponsoring this episode of The History Guy. BetterHelp is a 100% online service that matches you with a licensed professional because you deserve to be happy, right? Just like history, life has its ups and downs, and BetterHelp is a simple, discreet, trustworthy way to find a good match with a licensed vetted professional. Whether you need individual therapy or couples therapy or even help with your team, this is not some self-help app. It is a way to connect to a professional. In fact, it is a way to help choose among thousands of professionals to find the best match to help you overcome whatever it is that is interfering with your happiness so that you can live the best life you can. I'll be really honest, I struggled after my divorce, and it's hard to admit that you need help. And it was hard to find any therapist at all, more or less the right one, and I really wish that I had known about BetterHelp at the time. It can be a real hassle to find a therapist, and if you need a therapist, the last thing you need is more hassle. BetterHelp is really amazing. You just go online, answer a few questions, and they will help match you to a licensed, vetted professional. And their professionals are just licensed and vetted. They're paid competitive rates and benefits and given the flexibility that they need to be able to do their job well. And when you get a good match, you communicate when it works for you and the way that works for you, whether you prefer messaging or phone or video. And because it's online, you can get access to help anytime from virtually anywhere. It's not always easy to admit, but, frankly, history has not always treated the history guy well. We all need help sometimes. Therapy's made a huge difference in my life more than once, and finding the right professional can really help you make the sort of history that deserves to be remembered. So let's forget the stupid stigma, right? And just make it easy and convenient. More than 4 million people have found help through BetterHelp, and you can too. And get a special discount on your first month of professional therapy. Go to betterhelp.com/thehistoryguy or choose the History Guy when you sign up. Apples were first domesticated well into prehistory from wild trees in Central Asia. They've been eaten across all of human history and cultivated in China for more than 2,000 years. Apple seeds have been found in material carbon dated to 4000 BC in northern Italy, and some evidence suggests that the apple was cultivated in the Middle East in the 3rd millennium BC. Europeans were certainly growing apples in classical antiquity, and apples have been an important part of diets in much of the world for millennia. The idea of a pie, a baked dish with a filling, goes back millennia as well. Ancient Egyptians are known to have eaten a kind of food that had a closed crust of ground oats, wheat, rye, or barley, and often contained honey inside. These proto-pies, or gelettes, go back at least 8,000 years and could contain other fillings as well. The 4,000-year-old tablet provides a recipe for a chicken pie. Prior to the days of baking dishes, meat and just about anything else that you wanted to cook was encased in a thick layer of dough and was a kind of bready container to keep in juices. Flaky, pastry-like doughs were introduced in the Mediterranean, with phyllo-like doughs common in classical antiquity. Aristophanes mentions sweetmeats in his plays, including pastries filled with fruit. The ancient Romans used pastry made with water, oil, and flour to bake meats and keep in juices, but the pastry itself was not meant to be eaten. In Pie, A Global History, author Janet Clarkson summarizes that the basic idea of small sweet pastries came to Europe from the Arab world during the expansion of the Islamic empires. The European Middle Ages substituted oil for butter or shortening, which created a stiffer pastry. The Oxford English Dictionary traces the origin of the word pastry to the mid-14th century, while medieval Latin has a word for pie, meaning meat or fish enclosed in pastry. Richard II issued an ordinance to control pie prices in London in 1378, and Geoffrey Chaucer mentioned pie in the Canterbury Tales. And he could roast and seethe and broil and fry and make a good thick soup and bake a pie. Pies were also a useful means of preserving food in an era before canning and refrigeration. The first surviving historical recipe for apple pie comes from The Form of Cury, or Method of Cooking, a 14th century cookbook from England, purportedly written by the Master of Cooks of King Richard II. The book gives a recipe for apple pie, which it calls tarts in apples. This includes good apples, good spices, figs, raisins, and pears in a coffin or a casing of pastry that was generally not meant to be eaten. It may be surprising, but the word coffin actually meant basket or case, and it wasn't until later that it came to refer specifically to a casket. The filling would have been more familiar, although it would have been primarily a food for the wealthy, as sugar and spices were rare and expensive. Period English cooks for the wealthy probably had access to spices like nutmeg, ginger, and cloves, in addition to cinnamon. The kinds of apples used also would have varied, and it's difficult to be certain what kinds were used at the time because apples are what are called extreme heterozygotes, and a tree grown from an apple is extremely different genetically from its parent, leading to a huge variety of textures, taste, and other characteristics. To get the same apple on a different tree, the trees must be grafted, a common practice for 1,000 years. Known varieties from the period include the costard and the pearmain, both brought to England by the Normans. Other early recipes came from elsewhere in Europe. Johann Buchenhain, a clergyman and a cook at the court kitchen for the Pope of Avignon, includes one in his Registrum Coquine. He instructs cooks to peel and cut the apples in the manner of a communion wafer, then wrap them in pastry and cook them in olive oil. He says the food is for peasants. An early Dutch recipe dates to 1514. In a notable book of cookery, apple pies were common throughout northwestern Europe throughout the 16th century. Trade networks improved as time went on, and sugar became more available, leading to crusts and coffins that were meant to be eaten. A 1514 English cookbook titled A Proper New Book of Cookery contains a recipe for short paste for tart, and instructs the baker to make it thin and tender as ye may. It also includes a recipe for pies of green apples, which are pared and cored, as ye will a quince. Saffron is put in the crust, and cinnamon, sugar, ginger, and rosewater are used to spice the filling. The 16th century saw fruit pies become more common, although they were not always what we might expect. One recipe for pear pie from the Middle Ages instructs the baker to produce gobbets of bone marrow between the fruit pieces. This was all long before the United States was even a concept, and before any apples had been grown in the Western Hemisphere. The only kind of apple native to the Americans is the crab apple. It's called the common apple and is generally a poor substitute for the domesticated apple. Apples came to the Americas with the Europeans as seeds or seedlings, but struggled to thrive until populations of bees were imported as well. Among the progenitors of the American apple industry were the Puritans, who we know brought apple seeds with them to Plymouth in 1620. Within 15 years, Lord Baltimore in the Maryland colony wrote that settlers should bring kernels of pears and apples, especially of poppins, pearmains, and decens, for making thereafter of cider and perry. Survey records in 1644 show that 90% of Maryland farms had apple orchards. William Blackston may have planted the first apple orchard in North America as the first settler in what would become Boston in 1625. Apples were used in many ways on the American frontier, eaten fresh, fried, stewed, and baked, but more often turned into cider, vinegar, or brandy. Cider was a safer drink in the 17th century than water. Apples were also used in preserves as apple butter and even livestock feed. One thing missing from this list is our subject, the apple pie. According to Alan Metcalf in his book America in So Many Words, the earliest reference to apple pie in the British colonies comes from the Journal of a Bostonian from October 1st, 1697. Had first butter, honey, curds, and cream. For dinner, very good roast lamb, turkey fowls, apple pie. The first American recipe for apple pie doesn't appear until 1796, when one was listed in Amelia Simon's American Cookery. Simon's includes 3 recipes for apple pie. The first for just apple pie, which instructs the reader to stew and strain the apples. To every 3 pints, grate the peel of a fresh lemon, add cinnamon, mace, rosewater, sugar to your taste, and bake in paste. She also includes a recipe for a buttered apple pie, which instructs to add sugar, butter, and spices after a half hour of baking, and a third for dried apple pie, which uses dried apples and cranberries. Prior to Simon's book, English cookbooks were used, such as Hannah Glass's 1747 The Art of Cookery, Made Plain and Easy, the best-selling recipe book of the 18th century, which has an apple pie recipe that includes minced lemon and cloves. Apple pies do not seem to have been as common as they would later become. In 1779, George Washington invited friends to dinner and mentioned that the cook had had the surprising luck to discover the apples will make pies. Apple pies became an American staple in the 1800s as the frontier moved west. One thing any settler was sure to bring with them were apples. Johnny Appleseed, the real person, planted thousands of them as he walked west. Apple preservation improved as well in cellars as dried fruit and as apple butter, a technique especially used by the Pennsylvania Dutch. According to an 1850 article from Bath, England, the American way of preserving apples is to peel, cut in quarters, and dry them in an oven until they are quite hard. To become fit for use, the fruit is drenched in boiling water. It was this method of preservation to make house pies that likely led a Swedish reverend to comment in 1796 that apple pie was used all the year, the evening meal of children. House pie in country places is made of apples, neither peeled nor freed from their cores, and its crust is not broken if a wagon wheel goes over it. In the early years of the Republic, Dutch and German immigrants brought with them the medieval tradition of streusel-topped apple pie, what we in the U.S. call the Dutch apple pie. The Dutch also have a lattice-top variant, but in the 18th and 19th century, apple pie was hardly American. Jane Austen wrote that good apple pies are a considerable part of our domestic happiness. That was in England. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote that the pie is an English institution, which, planted on American soil, ran rampant and burst forth into an untold variety of genre and species, just as the apple pie itself did. The exact reasoning for why the pie became quintessentially American is more difficult to ascertain. In his book Apple Pie, An American Story, John T. Edge offers a number of possible explanations. The temperance movement led to fewer apples becoming cider, and German immigrants popularized beer over cider. The leftover apples were used for other things, including pie. During the Civil War, scavenging soldiers found few things in abundance, but perhaps most abundant were apples and flour. One soldier wrote that they would unceremoniously borrow and carry away bake ovens, take green apples, slice them into thin pieces, roll out crusts made from the flour, lay in the sliced apples, and cover with another crust. Perhaps the wartime treat gave America the taste for pie. Edge also says that America began to equate the apple pie with an ascendant, even triumphant, affluence. A German economist wrote that on the shoals of roast beef and apple pie, all socialistic utopias founder. Meanwhile, in the South, a Confederate recipe book included a recipe for apple pie without apples, which included crackers and cream of tartar. Ritz Crackers would popularize a version using their crackers in the next century. What is certain is that apple pie had become a national dish before the end of the 19th century. An 1887 issue of a newspaper from South Carolina records a church event that included a painting titled, "The Great American Dessert, Apple Pie." That same year, the Pottsville, Pennsylvania Republican wrote that the Great American Institution, apple pie. In 1889, a writer in the Milwaukee Sentinel commented on an ongoing effort to choose a national flower by saying, "What's the matter with the apple pie?" as a national emblem. In 1890, American newspapers were awash in reports that Queen Victoria ordered an American apple pie to eat. In 1895, a New York newspaper declared that every American is born with an appetite for pie. Pie faced criticism around the end of the 19th century as part of the health movement. Sarah Tyson Rohrer, often considered America's first dietitian, published multiple diatribes against the pie, such as Why I Oppose Pies in 1900 and Why I Have No Cakes and Pies on My Table in 1905 for the Ladies' Home Journal. She wrote that the inside of a pie is injurious and that pies and cakes are indistinguishable. Sarah Josephine Hale, famed writer and editor, attacked the pie in 1839 when she wrote that pies are more apt to prove injurious to persons of delicate constitutions than puddings because of the indigestible nature of the pastry, and that the dyspeptic should always avoid pies, as he would his bane, and for children they should be forbidden food, so tempting is the taste, that the only security consists in not tasting. Kate Masterson dubbed pie an American evil, even unmoral. No great man, she said, was ever fond of pie. In the early 1900s, San Francisco banned roving pie vendors that were ruineth the health of children. Pie was the subject of a debate at the University of Indianapolis about whether pie or ice cream is of greater service to mankind. The pro-pie debaters lost, prompting a New York Times writer to bemoan that they were not faithful to their important trust. In a vigorous defense, he wrote that pie is the American synonym for prosperity, the food of the heroic. No pie-eating people can be permanently vanquished. He then went on to claim that the British Empire's spread and success was because they were voracious eaters of pie, and the Empire's decline thanks to the pie's decline in British culture until they were left only with the insignificant tart. Most significantly, he says that in America, the seasons are known for their pies, with apple pie for all the year round. Carl Alsberg, the second head of the Food and Drug Administration, openly defended what the Washington Herald dubbed the American institution, apple pie, in 1913, while newspapers were pleased to report in 1909 that Teddy Roosevelt, off on a safari in Africa, had real American apple pie to remind him of home. In 1935, the New York Times reported that apple pie had been made an issue in Congress by representatives of rival apple-growing states. While the author states that apple pie is a national dish, a battle was brewing over the choice to serve Oregon apples in the congressional cloakroom. The Rochester, New York Chamber of Commerce sent 75 apples to Congress in retaliation to judge which state grew superior fruit. Connecticut got into the fight, too, arguing that apple pie was native to Connecticut, and therefore Connecticut and not anyone else made the best apple pies. Congress remained in a deadlock on the question. In 1926, Americans in Europe were reportedly unable to find apple pies like the kind they make at home. By 1940, pie philosopher Edward Ewell Whiting could tell a New York Times reporter that apple pie is a food, a cult of ceremony, if not a religion. A 1942 report from the Quartermaster General's office claimed that the apple pie appears more frequently than any other dessert on the military post menus. In 1941, Carmen Lombardo and John Jacob Loeb released the song, "Ma, I Miss Your Apple Pie." A popular slogan in response from soldiers was that they were fighting for the flag, Ma, and apple pie. FDR's White House chef claimed that apple pie was the president's favorite. When Betty Crocker introduced Pie Quick after World War II, the instant pie mixtures came with a package of dried apples. Apple pie has remained popular since, as well, and found new versions in the modern age. In 1968, McDonald's introduced its take on the apple pie as its first dessert, while Hostess introduced their line of fruit pies in 1964. Despite its European roots, apple pie has come to be known somehow as famously American. But the phrase as American as apple pie is of unknown origin. And early use in 1913 described a vaudevillian performer as being as typically American as apple pie. In 1924, an advertisement advertised suits that were as American as apple pie. And in 1928, the New York Times described First Lady Lou Hoover's homemaking skills as American as apple pie and corn pone, and at some point that just stuck, and all manner of things have been compared to apple pie, not just baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet, but in 1963, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution said that the shirtwaist was as American as apple pie, and in 1969, the San Angelo Times described garage sales as American as apple pie, and in 1990, a pigeon shooting event was defended by claiming that shooting pigeons was as American as apple pie and Chevrolet, and whatever the comparison, the mere fact that we use it shows that few things are as associated with America as apple pie. In fact, as apple pie is still by a wide margin America's favorite pie, you could even say that apple pie is as American as apple pie. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.